Hello, kippers and stingrays. Mr. Dias again. I'm going to read a couple stories to you today from different perspectives. Before I get started on that, I had mentioned earlier that one of the things you guys can do to ward off your cabin fever is to get out and look at some of the surroundings, the birds and the animals, as we're moving into the nesting season. Seeing a lot of interesting behaviors out here, which are kind of fun to watch. My mockingbird's starting up. He's one of the gray and white birds that mimics the sounds of other birds. He's one of my favorites. So he's out here right now, and he'll be working to lay down a few bars. And when he gets it perfected, he'll sing it day and night until he finds the right matchup. And there's a few others. I got some woodpeckers working over above my head, some downies and some hares. There's a pileated that keeps sneaking in now and then. And off in the field behind me, there's a big old tom rooster turkey, and he's been out there making a lot of noise, and he's got good ears, so he can probably hear me talking right now and heading back to the woods. But he's got his gang of girls and young jakes with him, and he comes out in the field every day. So there's a lot to see out there, a lot going on right now. The hummingbirds will be back soon, and they make some amazing aerial displays when they're getting into their nesting and the mating season. So take advantage of the opportunity and get out and see what's going on the shore and enjoy it. So, today's book, and books actually, is dealing with different perspectives. We always talk about, you see things from the way you see it in real time. You get it based on your experiences, your knowledge, your life, and the way you see things. And I always express to you, well, see it from their perspective and see the way they see it, and so that's what today's about. These books that were set up pretty neat. They're called Upside Down Tales. And so it starts with Hansel and Gretel, which is a pretty familiar story. You've probably read it before or heard it before. If not, it's kind of fun. Uh, Terrifying, but fun. Um, but then after we read through the traditional Hansel and Gretel that you've read, we switch it around and we're going to see it from the witch's perspective. So we talk about the antagonist and the protagonist. And so who is the antagonist here? Who's the evil doer, and who are the protagonists that are the set upon the good guy, the main character. And when you see it from a different perspective, then you might have a different interpretation of who's who and who's the protagonist, who's the antagonist. So it's an interesting way of looking at things, and I thought it was pretty unique way of putting books together. And I appreciate my sister Sharon brought these to me. After I started reading, folks started offering me books to supplement what I had through the library, so that's pretty cool. So let's get on with this. This is Hansel and Gretel. It's a story told by Shelia Black, and it's illustrated by Arlene Clemuson. And looking at it from the witch's perspective, I did that for the first time today, and it opened my eyes to a bunch of things. So, beside a forest, and if you start to get tired of listening to what I'm reading, you just space out, close your eyes, and listen to the birds that are tweeting in the background. It's a pretty day out here, as long as the wind's not blowing. All right, Hansel and Gretel. Beside a great forest, there once lived a poor woodcutter with his wife and two children from his first marriage, a boy named Hansel and a girl named Gretel. One night, as the woodcutter lay awake worrying, his wife said, "What will become of us? How can we feed our children when we can hardly have enough to feed ourselves?" It occurred to me that I don't have my eyes on. That's better. "There's only one thing we can do," his wife answered. "We must take the children deep into the forest and leave them there." The woodcutter did not wish to do this, but his wife nagged him until he agreed to her plan. Hansel and Gretel overheard the stepmother's words. Gretel began to cry, but Hansel said, "Don't be afraid, little sister. I will find a way to save us." When their parents had fallen asleep, Hansel tiptoed downstairs and out the door. The round moon was shining so brightly that the white pebbles in the front of the house gleamed like silver coins. Hansel quickly filled his pockets with them, then he crept back upstairs to bed. Early the next morning, before the sun had even risen, Hansel and Gretel's stepmother shook them awake. Get up, you lazy bones, get dressed, she said. Today you are going with us to the forest to chop wood. Then she gave them each a tiny piece of bread, and they set off. As they walked along, Hansel kept turning around and looking back at their house. Hurry up, said his father crossly. What are you doing back there? I'm just waving my little sister. I'm just waving to my little white kitten, Hansel replied. He's sitting on the roof and mewing goodbye. But Hansel was not really waving to his kitten. Each time he turned, he dropped a pebble on the path. At last they came to a grove of tall trees deep in the forest. There Hansel and Gretel's father built a fire. Sit here where it's warm, children, and eat your lunch, their stepmother said. Your father and I are going to chop wood, and when we're done, we'll come and fetch you. Hansel and Gretel sat by the fire and ate their bread. After a while, they fell asleep. When they awoke, it was night, and they were alone. Soon the moon rose, shining with a bright silvery light. Then Hansel took his sister's hand, and they followed the gleaming trail of pebbles home. Hansel and Gretel's stepmother pretended to be glad to see them, but the woodcutter was truly happy that his children were safely home again, for he had never wanted to leave them in the great forest. However, before long, the woodcutter's cupboards were empty again. We must take the children even deeper into the forest and leave them there, Hansel and Gretel's stepmother told her husband one night. Oh no, said the woodcutter, but his wife gave him no peace until he agreed. Having heard the conversation, clever Hansel once again crept downstairs to gather pebbles, but this time the door was locked. Very early the next morning, Hansel and Gretel's stepmother shook them awake. Then she gave them each a very small piece of bread, and they set off into the forest. As they went, Hansel crumbled the bread in his pocket and scattered the crumbs along the path. This time they walked and they walked until they came to a part of the forest Hansel and Gretel had never seen before. There, Father built them a fire. Then he and his wife went into the forest to chop wood. Gretel shared her piece of bread with Hansel. Then both children went to sleep. When they woke, it was night, and the sky was black. Gretel began to cry, but Hansel said, Don't be afraid. Wait until the moon rises. Then we'll follow the crumbs of bread I scattered until we are home. But then the moon rose, and there was no bread crumbs to be seen. The hungry birds had eaten every one. And then they sit, scared in the forest. Don't worry, Hansel told his sister. We'll find our way home. But although they walked all night and all the next day, they could not find their way out of the forest. At last, when the children were so tired and hungry they had hardly taken another step, they spotted the cottage through the trees. As they drew closer, they saw that the cottage was made of gingerbread, with a roof of almond cake and windows of hard sugar candy. Now we can have ourselves a good meal, Hansel cried. Happily, I'll eat some of the roof, and Gretel, you have a piece of the window. So the children sat down and ate and ate. Suddenly the door of the house flew open, and out came an old woman, walking with a cane. Hansel and Gretel were frightened and began to run. Wait, dear children, come back, the old woman called. After them in a kind voice, I won't hurt you. The old woman took them inside her gingerbread house and fed them apple pancakes, cinnamon buns, and hot cocoa. Then she showed them upstairs to a room with 2 little beds covered in warm quilts. Hansel and Gretel were sure that they had been rescued at last, and all night long they dreamed happy dreams. But early the next morning the witch woke up Hansel and dragged him downstairs to the cellar. She locked the door, then went upstairs to shake Gretel awake. Time for work, you lazy bones, she screeched. You must help me clean and cook. I wish to fatten your brother up so I can eat him. Gretel wept and pleaded, but it was no use. The witch made all sorts of tasty things for Hansel to eat. Chicken and dumplings, roasted potatoes, apple cake with cream. Every morning she went to the cellar door. Stick out your finger, she told Hansel, so I can see if you're... Stick out your finger, she told Hansel, so I can see if you are fat yet. But clever Hansel, knowing the witch was nearsighted, stuck out a chicken bone instead. And so she went away grumbling, for she could not understand why Hansel was not yet fat. After 4 weeks had passed, the witch could wait no longer. I shall eat Hansel whether he is fat or thin, she muttered. Then she shouted to Gretel, Put on the water and boil a while. I'll knead the dough for bread. When the dough was ready, the witch said to Gretel, The oven is lit. Crawl inside for me and see if it's hot enough. Now the witch meant to shut Gretel in the oven and cook her for supper, along with Hansel. But Gretel guessed what the witch was up to, and so she said, I don't understand. How am I to crawl inside there? It's not nearly big enough. Oh, of course it's big enough, you silly goose, said the witch. Just put your head in and crawl in like this. Just then Gretel pushed the witch in as hard as she could. Right into the oven, Gretel slammed the door and locked it tight. How horribly the witch howled, but Gretel didn't stay to listen. She ran and unlocked the cellar door. Oh, Hansel, she cried. We are saved. The wicked witch is dead, and she hugged her brother. The two decided to explore the witch's house. In one room, they found a chest full of diamonds and pearls and other precious jewels. Hansel stuffed his pockets with them and told Gretel to do the same. Now let us leave this forest, he said, and find our way home. He took his sister's hand, and they walked toward evening. They came to a meadow dotted with flowers. Across a meadow was a little cottage. Why, that's our house, Gretel cried, and she and Hansel ran away the way to the front door. Inside, their father was sitting in front of the fireplace. His cruel wife had died, and he had not had a happy moment since he left Hansel and Gretel in the forest. When he saw his two children, he burst into tears of joy. Then Hansel and Gretel emptied their pockets, and jewels in all colors scattered on the floor. Now we will be rich, Hansel said, and we can all live happily after. And that's exactly what they did. Now that's how the story of Hansel and Gretel is usually told. But some say there's another story that goes a little differently. If you want to know what it is, turn this book upside down. All right. Gotta take a sip. Yep. One of my juice concoctions that you guys are familiar with. All right. Don't worry. It's cold out here and it makes my nose run. I'm healthy. All right, now you saw that from Hansel and Gretel's perspective, and clearly by that perspective and that version of the story, they were, basically thrown out and cast away by their parents, put upon by a wicked old witch, and nearly eaten. And they managed to save themselves and get back home and live happily ever after. But what about the rest of the story? What about a different perspective? So now we're going to read the witch's story. And maybe, if you're still there, you'll see things from a different perspective. All right. And I'll get to try on some different voices. I'm sure you know the story of Hansel and Gretel. That means you've heard all about the wicked witch who lures children to gingerbread house so that she can roast them for supper. Well, I'm Agatha, the wicked witch herself, and there's not a shred of truth in the story of Hansel and Gretel that I'll tell you about. For one thing, witches almost never, ever eat children. After all, there are so many nicer things to eat. Gingerbread and apple pancakes, for example. Indeed, eating children was the last thing I had on my mind the day Hansel and Gretel showed up. All had begun as my cat Selina and I were sitting down to enjoy a slice of bat wing cake and a cup of newt tea. All of a sudden we heard the most awful crunching and munching noises. Galloping gazooks, I cried. What on earth is that? Selina peered out the window. Children, she said calmly. Human children. They're eating your house. Like most cats, Selina is perfectly capable of speaking in English. Eating my house, I repeated. Grabbing my broomstick, I ran to the front door. Excuse me, I said politely. Would you please stop eating my house? But the children, there were two of them, paid absolutely no attention. They just kept on breaking my sugar window panes, knocking the gingerbread tiles off the roof. So I stomped my foot and shouted, "Stop this instant! I'll turn you both into toads." The little girl Gretel dropped the window pane she was eating with a crash. "Are you a, a witch?" she gasped. "Yes, I am," I replied crossly. The boy Hansel stammered, "Please don't turn us into toads. We didn't mean any harm. We were just hungry. We haven't eaten for 2 whole days." "Doesn't anyone feed you at home?" I asked. "We haven't been home," Gretel explained. "You see, we ran away." "She means our cruel stepmother threw us out," Hansel interrupted. "She left us in the woods without a bite to eat." "I see," I said, although I didn't see it all. "Well, you still can't eat my house. If you're so hungry, why didn't you come knock on the door? Inside, I'll feed you." I was about to have some newt tea and bat wing cake. Seeing the horrified looks on their faces, she quickly added, lemon tea and apple cake." "That's all right," squeaked Gretel. "We're not all that hungry," said Hansel. "Oh, come on," I said cheerfully. "I won't hurt you." The two children slowly followed me inside to the sitting room. "Make yourselves at home," I said. "Excuse me while I put the cake in to bake." Selina was curled up in front of the oven, and she gave me a most disapproving look. "Honestly, Agatha," she said, "what would your sister Tabitha say? Inviting 2 human children in for apple cake after they practically wrecked your house? Besides, those children are trouble. Mark my words." "Oh, come on, Selina," I said. "It's nice to have company." I picked up my magic wand, the main ingredient in all witch magic, and spoke my bacon apple cake spell. The flour, sugar, and butter measured themselves into the bowl. The eggs bobbed up and broke themselves. The apples peeled themselves and cut themselves into slices. And the wooden spoon leaped out of the drawer and had the whole mixture stirred in a jiffy. Besides, I went on, those children don't mean any harm. They're just lost and hungry. No sooner were those words out of my mouth when Hansel shrieked, "Now!" A rope flew over my head and I fell to the ground with a crash. Selina yowled and leaped through 3 feet into the air, knocking the bowl of apple cake batter off the table so that it landed with a splat on my head. I didn't realize what was happening until I heard Hansel say, "Gretel, quick, help me tie her up." "Wait," I cried, "stop." But of course the bowl of cake batter was on my head. It came out as "beep, glop," that the children paid no attention. "Take this bowl off my head," I yelled, but all it sounded like was "Akith yow toff" at the end. "What's she saying?" Gretel said. "I don't know," replied Hansel grimly. "It's probably some horrible spell." "Oh," Gretel shrieked. "Let's get her out of here." "We can't do that," said Hansel. "She'll only come for us as soon as she manages to get free. There's only one thing to do. Put her in the oven and bake her." "No, no," I yelped. I couldn't believe what I had left my magic wand on the table. Without it, I was quite helpless. Where is Selina, I wondered. Why isn't she helping me? "But it seems awfully mean to bake her alive," Gretel said. "After all, she was going to make us an apple cake." "You mean you believe that stuff about the apple cake?" Hansel asked scornfully. "Witches only say things like that to trick children. She was going to eat us." "Really?" Gretel asked. "Eat us? How do you know?" "I read all about it in a book," Hansel said firmly. "Now, let's push her in the oven and before it's too late." Just then I heard the back door burst open. "What's going on here?" a voice boomed. I knew that voice. It was my older sister Tabitha. I heard Tabitha say. "You were quite right, Selina. These human children certainly have plenty of trouble. Look at poor Agatha, all tied up and with a mixing bowl on her head." Tabitha took the bowl off my head. "I see you've gotten yourself into trouble by being too soft-hearted again," she said. Then she turned to Hansel and Gretel and lifted her magic wand. "As for you," she said sternly, "if there's one thing that I loathe, it's children who don't do as they're told. First you eat my sister's house, then you trap her like a mouse. You two kids have not been nice, so now I'll turn you into mice. There was a bright flash of light, and Hansel and Gretel vanished. In place, there were two gray mice. When Tabitha untied me, honestly, Agatha, she said, dusting off her hands, how did you get into this pickle? Sorry, Tabitha, I said meekly. What shall I do with the children? I mean, the mice. Do with them, Tabitha said. Why, toss them in the oven. The mice began squeaking with fright. Hang them up by their tails. I don't care what you do with them. Well, it's just that I feel a little sorry for them, I explained. Tabitha's face turned dark plum color. Sorry for them, she mocked. These wretched creatures tried to roast you in your oven. Really, Agatha, you're a disgrace to witches everywhere. But I don't have time to waste on this nonsense. I'm expected at the monthly meeting of the Society of Wicked Witches, an organization you might still belong to. Agatha, if you didn't have such a soft heart and an even softer head, you'd be in the club. And with that, Tabitha got on her broomstick and flew away in a huff. I looked around my kitchen and sighed. It was a mess. There was apple cake batter everywhere. Then I looked down at the shivering mice. Tabitha's right, I said. I really should hang you both by your tails. But I added, with a shrug, I'm not Tabitha, and picking up my magic wand, I chanted, let us do this over right. Make my house so clean and bright. Then light the oven up to bake another scrumptious apple cake. And it was not very nice to turn these children into mice. A twinkling light gleamed in the kitchen and put everything back in its place. More apple cake batter mixed itself together and popped itself into the oven. Then the light settled on the mice. With a bang, they vanished, and there stood Hansel and Gretel. We're sorry, said Hansel. We don't think you're a terrible witch, like your sister said, Gretel added shyly. In fact, we think you're a terrific witch. And she ran up and hugged me. I was so embarrassed. That's all right, I said. No hard feelings. I only hope you're both still hungry because the apple cake is almost done. We all sat down at the table, and Hansel and Gretel ate and ate. When there wasn't a crumb left, I said, now perhaps you two should think about getting home. But we can't, said Hansel. Our cruel stepmother. Oh no, I interrupted them. Now let me tell you the truth. Why did you run away from home? We heard our father and stepmother talking, Gretel sniffed. Father said he didn't know how they were going to feed us anymore. Mother said we ate enough for an army, put in Hansel. I see, she said. Did they know you were listening? Hansel and Gretel shook their head. Well, then, I said, it sounds to me like your parents probably just worried because, well, it sounds like they don't have a lot of money. Is that true? Hansel shook Gretel. They both nodded. Well, I said, not having enough money is a problem for many people. But luckily, I added with a smile, not for witches. Then I lifted my magic wand. Spirit of witches, black as night, fill their pockets with diamonds bright, and gold and silver and precious gems, so that their treasure never ends. Now, I said, empty your pockets, children. When they did, diamonds, pearls, emeralds, and sapphires came spilling out onto the floor. Each time you empty your pockets, the same thing will happen, I told them. We're rich, shouted Hansel. Yes, I said, but the spell will only last until tomorrow morning. Now it's time for you to go back home. But won't Mother and Father be mad at us? Hansel said. Well, I replied, I'll bet they'll be so happy to see you and safe and sound that they'll forget all about being cross. Now, how will you get there? Gretel asked. Don't worry, I said. Just hold your hands and close your eyes. Goodbye. Then I waved my wand one last time, and Hansel and Gretel vanished. About time, too, purred Selina. Well, I heard that Hansel and Gretel got home safely, and their parents were happy to see them. Now, you'd think that after all I had done for them, they'd tell everyone what a nice witch I am. But no, I'm afraid like most human beings, children, Hansel and Gretel are fond of telling stories. And the wilder the better. So not long after, I started hearing about Hansel and Gretel had met a wicked witch, so surely would have gotten them if they hadn't managed to stuff her in an oven and roast her first. For months, Tabitha was getting letters about it. They all began the same way. So sorry to hear about the tragic roasting of your sister Agatha. And I was always running into witches who said, "But Agatha, I thought you were cooked." It took ages to get the whole mess sorted out. I suppose I should be cross with Hansel and Gretel, but I'm not. You see, without meaning to, those children did me a real favor. Because of this story, I'm considered one of the wickedest witches around. Why, the Society of Wicked Witches has actually made me a member again, which is something Tabitha is happy about. Although she grumbles that all my fame is not unfair. It's amazing, Agatha, she says, that a hopeless witch like you got to be famous around the world over ever as the wickedest witch of all. The end. All right, well, that was a long one, and it's going to take forever to upload this thing. I'll figure that out later. But anyway, that's different perspectives, and that's what we talk about, seeing things from different people's angles. I suppose if y'all came marching down my driveway and started eating the roof off my house and my window panes, I would, be a little upset too. Well, I probably wouldn't throw you in my oven, but I'd probably treat you like termites. All right? So anyway, keep reading at home. Get out and see things. Keep growing. Stay safe. And remember, we all love you. Peace. Later.